Hi everyone, welcome back to Story of the World Chapter Highlights. I'm Sophie Teacher and this is chapter 29 of your Story of the World 4 books. Now today's chapter covers all about World War II, really what was happening in the middle of World War II and how the war ended both in Europe and Asia. At the very start of our chapter today, it's talking about events that were taking place in Europe just after the start of the war in 1940. Now, Germany became very famous for one of the techniques that they used within the war. This was called the Blitzkrieg. The Blitzkrieg was a strategy that Germany used where they invaded Denmark, which is a Scandinavian country, but it's attached to the northern part of Europe. It's not further up. So what they did was they invaded Denmark and then they were able to quickly come down into Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. And yeah, we call this the Blitzkrieg, which is the lightning war, because they moved like lightning. They were really quick. Now, because Germany had been very strong, they managed to push a lot of the Allied forces back. And this meant that many of the Allied forces ended up kind of getting pushed back all the way onto Dunkirk beach. Dunkirk is a beach that is in the north of France. So a lot of the Allied troops kind of got trapped here with no way out. You had German bombers shooting from the sky, and then you had German troops that were at the other side, more into the towns of France. So there was really no escape for the troops. So at that time, the Prime Minister of England was Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill made this very famous speech. And one of the things they said was, "We will fight them on the beaches. No matter what, we will get through, we will escape. We will have to fight them on the beaches if we do." So what happened was the Allied forces decided to come up with this plan, and it was the Dunkirk evacuation, which happened on June 4th, 1940. The Dunkirk evacuation basically meant ships would come to Dunkirk and rescue the people on the beach there, the soldiers, all the while being bombed by German bombers from the sky. Now, what is really famous about the Dunkirk evacuation is that it wasn't just warships and Navy vessels who were coming to save the people in Dunkirk, also civilians. So, people from the south of England who owned boats, they got on boats and went across the English Channel and they helped rescue people. This is actually all seen in the film Dunkirk, which was released a few years ago. But yeah, a lot of the, civilian ships came to help rescue people. And that was really brave because they weren't soldiers and they were civilians. Now, what happened after this was that there was still a lot more fighting in France, and France eventually had to sign this treaty with Germany. And it meant that the north of France, so that included Paris, became the German occupation zone. The south of France was still classed as a free zone or free France. But basically, the free zone or the free French, a lot of them still sided with the Germans, or at least the people in charge did. And this made some people in the south of France really mad. They didn't want to side with Germany. They still wanted to hold on to their independence. So we called them the Free French, who were in the south of France. Now, one big problem that Britain started to deal with in World War II was the U-boats, which were really strong submarines that were owned by Germany. Hitler was determined to take Great Britain, and he thought he would do this by sending U-boats around England and in the English Channel. And basically, they would torpedo and shoot any vessel that was trying to get to England. He was trying to cut them off. And they sank more than 2,000 ships that were around Great Britain. And there was also battles going on in the air. You had the RAF, who's the Royal Air Force in England, and the Luftwaffe, who were the German Air Force. And they had lots of battles in the air, which eventually came to be known as the Battle of Britain, the battle to keep Britain safe. Now, after some time, Hitler realized it wasn't working very well. So he ended up turning on what was an ally, the Soviet Union, and he took a lot of their lands, such as Estonia and Lithuania and all that northern area that we learned about before. So while this was all happening, there was a lot going on in Italy, okay? There was a lot of different things happening in Italy. Now, people were starting to get really tired of the war in Italy. And we learned about this man before. So King Victor Emmanuel III was still the king, even though Mussolini was the prime minister. King Victor Emmanuel, he decided, okay, it's the end of this. We can't do this anymore. So he summoned Mussolini to meet him, and he told Mussolini that he would no longer be the prime minister of Italy. Now, what we've learned about Mussolini so far is that he has a very strong-natured personality, and he thought, I'm not listening to this, and he decided to run away. He was arrested, but then rescued again, and he ran to the north of Italy. And from there, him and the fascists decided to fight for their freedom and fight for the fascist party. But against them was the partisans. The partisans were the people in Italy who disagreed with the war and disagreed with the fascists, and they fought back. Okay? Now, going back to France at this time, there's a really important day that is still celebrated in countries such as America and the UK, and it's D-Day. D-Day is when they did the Normandy landings. So this is June 6, 1944, so we're a few years ahead now. And basically what happened was that the Allied forces had a plan. Their plan was to get as many men as possible on the northern beaches of France in the shortest time. They thought if they can do that, they can shock the Germans and manage to push them back. That was their strategy. So the Americans were sent to Normandy, and they had code names like Omaha and Utah. And the British and Canadians were sent to 3 other beaches, which included like the Gold, the Juno, and the Sword were their names. And that was what they did. They pushed back, and this was vital in pushing back Germany from France and from Europe. D-Day marks the start of the end of Germany's occupation of Europe. So this is a really, really important date, okay, D-Day. So Dwight Eisenhower was the US general who was leading the Americans, and then Charles de Gaulle was the leader of the Free French. He's a really important figure. We'll learn about him a little later when he becomes the president of France. But yeah, Charles de Gaulle is very important here. And yeah, he was the leader of the Free French, those French in the South who didn't agree with the German occupation. And then finally, on August 25th, 1944, Charles de Gaulle, Eisenhower, and all of the Allied forces were able to march into France and finally push their way down to Paris. So this was really, really important. And at this point, Germany and Italy started to lose a lot of their powers in Europe. So remember, these are the axis of evil we talked about who were happening in Europe. Now, on December 16th, 1944, there was the Battle of the Bulge. They call it this because of the shape in which that the Germans pushed back the Allied forces. Now, the Germans were very, very strong in this battle. But unfortunately for them, the Allied forces, after the victory of D-Day, they felt really strong about the fact they could win this war. So they pushed back and the Germans had to retreat. And this is kind of where everything started to unravel. So in April 1945, Soviet troops finally marched into Berlin, the capital of Germany. And then there was 2 different things that happened that aligned with each other. In Italy, the partisans finally beat the fascists, and Mussolini was killed in the streets of Italy. Also, in April 30th, 1945, the Germans, the Nazi party had been pushed back so much, Adolf Hitler and his wife went into hiding in a bunker, and Hitler knew if he was caught, he would have a lot of things that he had to pay for. So he killed himself in the bunker. So this is how both Mussolini and Hitler were killed, the leaders of those 2 main axes of evils. So then finally, on May 8th, 1945, it was VE Day, also a holiday still in places like England and the US. And VE Day is called Victory in Europe Day. It specifically makes it so we talk about Europe because there was still a war happening in Asia. Now, if you remember from last time, we talked about what was happening in Asia, and Japan's empire was spreading and getting bigger, and they were taking more and more land. And, after Pearl Harbor, there was a lot more fighting going on. So what was happening to end the war in Asia? So what was happening in Asia was that the Allied forces, after, everything that had been happening in Europe, they gave Japan a chance. They wrote a letter to Japan, and it says, surrender or we'll invade you. That was your choice, surrender or we'll invade. And Japan said, no, we're not going to do that. They still felt like they were too strong to give up. So what was happening, if we go back a little bit, there's Albert Einstein, the famous scientist. He was actually a Jewish man and he was living in Germany. He's from Germany. Now, because he was Jewish, he had a lot of issues with Hitler. And, he had all of these ideas and all of, these experiments he'd done and discoveries, but Hitler didn't believe him because he was Jewish. And he even sent people to, destroy his apartment and, kind of ruin things for him. So Einstein decided to go to America. And he had lots of information that was useful to the Americans. And he told FDR, so Franklin D. Roosevelt, he said, the Germans are trying to make an atomic bomb. An atomic bomb had never been used before in warfare. It hadn't even been invented up until this point. But they thought if we can split the atom and make this chemical reaction happen, it will create a huge bomb. So FDR said, this is not good. We need to do something about this. And he created the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was to push for the creation of the first atomic bomb in America. So he got together two scientists. There's Enrico Fermi and J. Robert Oppenheimer. You might have heard of Oppenheimer from the very famous film that came out a few years ago. And that was the story of how he made the atomic bomb. So they were the two scientists behind the project. And on December 2nd, 1942, they finally made that reaction possible. Okay, and they ended up doing the first test July 19th at 5:30 a.m. This was the first test. And this test was very successful. People even described seeing it and saying they could feel the heat on their face as soon as it went off. And it's described as this mushroom cloud you hear a lot when talking about atomic bombs. Now, by this point, FDR was no longer president, and it was William S. Truman. And Truman said, we've given Japan a chance. This is the only way we're going to end the war in Asia. And he allowed them to drop the bombs on Japan. So this is where we get to the use of the atomic bomb in Asia. So there was two cities that were bombed. It was Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima was the first one. It was on the plane the Enola Gay, and the name of the bomb was, they called him Little Boy. Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima. It was dropped on civilians in Hiroshima, and instantly 80,000 people died. This doesn't include people who died later from nuclear fallout, which is, issues such as cancer and other issues that you can get from radiation. And then the other city a few days later was Nagasaki. Nagasaki, they called the bomb Fat Man after Winston Churchill. And at this point, 75,000 people died. So instantaneously, almost 200,000 people had been killed, mostly civilians at this point. So not long after, a few days later, on August 16th, Japan surrendered, and they surrendered the war. August 10th and August 14th, World War II officially ended around the world. And at the end of that, the United Nations was finally formed, the United Nations. So before we talked about the League of Nations, now the United Nations had been formed. There was a lot of people who disagreed with the use of the atomic bombs. It ended the war, but it had killed a lot of civilians. So people wondered if that was morally right. So the United Nations was formed, and it was to keep peace around the world and also to stop people from using atomic bombs in warfare again. Okay, well done, everyone.